Hey, what's up? I am Skinner Myers, and you are listening to the World is Wrong podcast.
We're here to tell you how the world is wrong. The world is wrong about
Black cinema.
Welcome to The World is Wrong, an extremely positive podcast where we celebrate films and film artists the world is wrong about. I am one of your intrepid hosts, and my name is Andras Jones.
And my name is Brian Connolly, and I'm also a host, but not intrepid.
You are untrepid.
Untrepid.
And we are here to talk not about a particular film. This is the return to the World is Wrong podcast of our old friend Skinner Myers. You might remember him from our Chameleon Street episode, which he introduced me to, and thereby introduced us to. And that film has been rediscovered significantly since then. So thank you to Skinner for keeping us hip that way. And he also introduced us to next week's film, Residue, from the director Merawi Gerima, who you'll hear Skinner talking about in the upcoming interview. He nominated Residue for an Oscar last year. And Skinner is a professor of film at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's the director of the new film, The Sleeping Negro, which is currently playing at festivals and limited short runs in cities around the U.S. And I met Skinner when he was a client at the management company where I was working, and so that's how I got to know him and see one of his earlier short films called Frank Embry, which became a segment in The Sleeping Negro, and was totally blown away by him as an artist, and that's why I like to have him on the show. And this week, the professor is in the house to discuss how the world is wrong about black cinema. And I know that might be an audacious statement, but Skinner is an audacious artist, and as I have already said, I am an intrepid host and interviewer. Brian is not, which is why he didn't make it to the interview. He's untrepid, which is why he has his outrepid.
Yeah.
Like it keeps your nervous system. Being intrepid can be very stressful. So Skinner's here to share his point of view on how the world is wrong about black cinema, and it's an educated and a grounded and an insightful point of view, and I hope you'll stick around and listen to it. And if you're not, really, you've only got like 4 minutes into this podcast. Why would you check out now when I've just teased it so wonderfully? I guess we're gonna start with a clip from Skinner's film, The Sleeping Negro, which is a film we reference a lot in this interview, and then we'll go to the interview, and afterwards I'm curious to hear what you make of it, Brian.
Great.
There might be spoilers. There might be spoilers. There might be spoilers.
I'm 35 years old. I have 29 teeth, 10 shirts, 10 pairs of pants, 5 pairs of shoes, 24 socks, and $6,000 a month to live on. Something is broken. My notion of belonging to the world is starting to slip away from me. My past, my present, and my future merge into one.
Welcome to The World is Wrong, Skinner. Welcome back, I should say.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
Yes, and you are here to tell us how the world is wrong about black cinema. Professor, please begin your lesson.
Well, I'll just say off the jump, I think my good friend Mtume Gant, shout out to him. He's a professor and a black filmmaker and an MC in New York City. We talk about this all the time because he and I and Merawi Gerima and Jonathan Burnett are working on this anthology feature film project. But I think what we've had for most of the American cinema life in this country is Black Hollywood and not Black cinema. We had a moment of Black cinema, which I would consider films from the LA Rebellion, which were the filmmakers from UCLA in the 60s and 70s, early 80s, that came out of that film program. And their goal was to make Black cinema that was antagonistic towards the modes signifying practices that Hollywood was partaking in, and how Hollywood was treating Black characters and story. So I feel like we don't have a lot of Black cinema currently. Most of what comes out via some Hollywood entity, whether it's a studio or big financing company, is Black Hollywood. It's not Black cinema. And I think that's an important distinction to make. I think that Black cinema has to work towards changing the social order that we currently live under, and it has to fight for the liberation of Black people, for Black struggles. And that could mean form. I mean, it means form and content both. I will say, there's nothing wrong with watching something for entertainment value, but if that's the only thing that one is pursuing, then that's a big problem, because then you're allowing the status quo to remain the status quo. And I think for Black people, we don't have the luxury to allow things to continue the way they are. So we should use all forms of resistance, and that's political, art, any form of art, music, painting, all of that stuff, either in its content or in the discourse and conversations and actions that we put into place through this content, right? The doors that open through this content. So, I think that's kind of where we're at just in the world. I mean, if you just take like African cinema, I mean, most of the, Anglophone, Francophone, like African countries didn't really get a chance to start developing their own cinematic language until after colonization, which we're talking like 70s for a lot of the countries, So cinema is super, super, super young in lots of different countries in Africa. And then you also have an emulation, like in Nigeria, there's Nollywood, which, a lot of African filmmakers, because of the effects of capitalism and neo-colonialism or post-colonialism, which is kind of like an oxymoron, people are suffering. So they're trying to find ways to break in, make money. And so they're making films that are full of, African actors, maybe some African stories, but they're trying to Hollywood-ize it. And so there was a lot of great African filmmakers from the 60s and 70s that are past, they died, and they were really trying to discover what African cinema was for Africa, for the countries in Africa, And I think we have the same issue here in America as Black filmmakers. We're American based on the institutions that raise us up, school, church, family. And you're basically a nomad in a way, right? Mm-hmm. James Baldwin has this quote that I'll paraphrase because I don't remember exactly how it was worded, but basically it's like, I'm African with no memory. I'm an American with no privilege, right? Mm-hmm. So you're kind of like a nomad. You're in the middle of nowhere, but you're trying to craft. Trying to craft a cinematic language that speaks to the memory and identity that you lost based on your ancestors coming over as slaves, And so this the other day, it's like when you're learning a language, the best way to learn a language is to learn the culture of the people that you're trying to learn the language from, Mm-hmm. That helps you kind of understand the nuance. And so for Black Americans, our default culture is this patriotic Americanism that we have to fight against because that's not really us. But there's a big disconnect to our African ancestors. So it's, it's good and bad. It's good in the way where there's a lot of space for creativity. There's a lot of space for great imagination, reimagining what Black cinema can be completely. but whenever you're creating something from the beginning, you have nothing to work off of. It's quite challenging to kind of get going, you know. And also, because we live in a global capitalistic society, the market kind of dictates who gets resources to make movies. And that's another problem, you know. Merawi Gerima talks about, he has a theory called triangular cinema theory, which boiled down to a nutshell is basically, you know, you have the filmmakers, you have the audience, and you have the critics. And there has to be a reimagination, a re-education on how filmmakers make films, how audience consume the films, and how critics critique the films in order to uplift the Black community and change the social order that we're in. And that's a hard thing to do because capitalism has dangled a carrot of money and success and wealth in front of everybody. And so a lot of people don't want to, you know, fight the struggle. I mean, it's.
Can I ask you a question? Actually, because I'm kind of curious with that triangle theory, and you're talking about capitalism. It seems like what's left. It seems like there's a fourth quadrant there, which is the money. Like like unless because I guess in that view of filmmaking, the filmmakers and the funding sources for the filmmakers are seen as the same thing. Where, I mean, you're not just saying this, but you seem to be explicitly saying this, and it seems like it's just an obvious fact of the whole history of cinema is that there is a big disconnect between the filmmakers and the funding. So how does that figure into that theory?
Well, I think it would figure in because the people who have the money, they're like the wealthy audience.
Got it.
Member, right? And so, one, they want to fund stuff that they can enjoy. And two, because of how the market dictates what gets made and whatnot, they're also trying to make money. So they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, where in that regard, cinema can only be for escapism and entertainment purposes only. And there's a problem if you really drill down to it. Like, you know, I have students who say, "Oh, I love cinema because I can escape my reality and live in a fantasy world." Well, why is that? Because capitalism, white supremacy, has created such a horrific existence for a lot of us that we're trying to find modes of escapism, and not just movies, but in other aspects of life, you know, whether it's drugs, alcohol, or religion, or, you know, whatever.
These all seem like themes that you've explored in your film, The Sleeping Negro.
Yeah.
That seems these are, we haven't mentioned it yet. Obviously, we mentioned it in the intro, but feel free to use your film, The Sleeping Negro, as to offer examples throughout this. I'd like to encourage people to check out that film, and since it's not really available for everyone, we couldn't really do an episode about it. But this is our way of kind of sneaking that in here. So feel free to use that as an example, because as you're talking about it, I'm seeing images from the film. So the art, in your case, the art and the agenda seem to be one.
Yeah. I mean, like, obviously, it takes money to make movies, right?
But if you're really good at it, you don't need that much money, as you proved.
Yeah, no, it's true. But one thing we're really good at in this country is prioritizing money-making schemes and prioritizing corporations. I mean, this country's run a very corporate-ran company by corporations. So other countries in Europe and other places, they still have funds for film where it's a grant that usually provides most, if not all, of the budget for a movie, and it's to advance culture, because culture, kind of like can be changed based on what the masses deem, right? And the countries that have money for films, it's like there's no pressure to make money on this movie. I can just make it, say something really important, and have this grant money and find an audience that way. And it's like people want to see stuff that's not Hollywood. They just don't have that choice. I've had so many conversations with people with the Sleeping Negro. I've been traveling with it around the world, and they're like, "Oh, it's so nice to see something that's not, just car chases or shootouts or whatever, that you can chew on, stuff that you can chew on." And there's a lot of filmmakers out there like myself, but because of how the market operates, when you make a film like this, then everyone's trying to force it into like this capitalistic box. And
who's your audience? Yeah, sorry.
Well,
that's like the question that always, like, who is the audience for this? Yeah,
like I spoke to this PR company when we were before we played Slam Dance, and they were like, "We love the film. We thought you dealt with the issues responsibly," which I was like, "I don't know what that means." Yeah. And they're like, we have to like kind of make this a little bit more accessible to people. And I was like, clearly you don't get it. Like people, it's funny. Not everybody, but a lot of people that have watched the film who've liked it, because a lot of people hate it. That's fine. I mean, I'd rather you hate it than just be like, "Yeah, it was okay." Because you'll talk about how much you hate it, or you talk about how much you love it, And people who are like, "Oh man, it's great," for your next one, like, you gotta like think, how can you get to like a bigger audience? Like, I would love to see you do something in the space of like horror, or like, how can you? Because everything goes back to Jordan Peele, and because I put that, quip in the Sleeping Negro, this little quip about Get Out. I mean, the movie was shot in the summer of 2019. We're talking almost 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And nowadays you hear that quip in a lot of movies, and it's kind of like, it's kind of worn out now. But they think because I've mentioned Jordan Peele's Get Out that I'm a fan of his, and I'm not a fan. I don't hate him, but I don't know him, right? But I'm not a fan of him, his films. And that was like a tongue-in-cheek kind of meta thing that I put in there for a reason. But they're just like, "Oh, I'd love to see you in the horror space. I'd love to see you take your social commentary and your visual style and like apply it to basic commercial application where you can make money off of it." And I'm like, you people don't get it. Like, I'm never going to do that. You know what I'm saying? I'm never going to do that. So
it seems very, I grew up in a punk rock town. It seems like a very punk rock ethos, like the same kind of thing of like, no, it wouldn't, this band that people like Fugazi would not work on a major label. It would turn off all their fans and and no one else would like them. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, there's something here that, I know that your specific focus is Black cinema, and that's what we're here to talk about. But it also seems like that dichotomy between Black cinema and Black Hollywood could just be the difference between cinema and Hollywood in a more general sense. Like, anyone who wants, whether, if you're maybe it's a little bit easier now, but if you were like again, speaking to the town I come from, if you're a radical feminist filmmaker from Olympia in 1985, you're going to be up against not the same thing, because obviously it's different, but similar dynamics of like, you might do something cool and break through, but then unless you're willing to try and become Catherine Bigelow, no one's going to throw money at you, and you're going to disappear and maybe be rediscovered, 30 years later by people who are searching for the few feminist filmmakers from the 1980s. And it seems like a similar struggle. And I would hope that would be something that would create a cinematic solidarity, whether you are a Black filmmaker or a feminist filmmaker or just an interesting filmmaker who's anti-capitalist, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I'm working on this, PhD dissertation about this subject, and Black cinema is important to me. Obviously, I'm Black and I love my community, but I'm trying to come up with a theory. I call it antagonistic cinema theory, and it's the beginning stages. It's not fleshed out. It's borrowing from pieces from third cinema, fourth cinema. It's looking at Merawi Gerima's triangular cinema theory, nomadism. And I'm trying, because like basically the idea is if the theory has merit by the time I'm done with this experiment or this process of research, then any non-white people's or anybody who is just, who wants a more equitable society can tap into this theory for the type of cinema that they want to make. You know what I'm saying?
Could you explain something? Because I have a feeling that a large number of our audience may be more educated in popular film than in film theory. When you talk about first, second, third, and fourth cinema, would you mind just explaining what that is for our audience?
Yeah. In a nutshell, I mean, this is very, very broad and basic. But first cinema theory, or first cinema would be considered like Hollywood, right? Anything made through the Hollywood system. Second cinema would be considered auteur theory. So like auteurism, filmmakers who create their own style is very distinct, like a Wes Anderson type.
Or like a Cassavetes. Like I'm trying, like where would it sort of start? Would independent auteurism start around that era, like early 60s, Cassavetes?
Yeah. I mean, Cassavetes would be like second cinema. I mean, I think there's films in the second cinema vein that could be Hollywood. I mean, you could be second with a little bit of drinking on there. But the very basic is like first cinema is Hollywood, second cinema is like auteur theory, right? Basically, like the filmmaker decides like the style. Third cinema, basically was like meant to challenge Hollywood's model. So it was rooted in like revolutionary activism in like Latin America, right? Because like I would say second cinema, the auteurship of second cinema was probably based out of European art film, and it made its way to America. But third cinema, there's third cinema and there's third world cinema. So third world cinema is more of a geographical location, like cinema from the third world. And then third cinema is anti-Hollywood, anti-capitalist, revolutionary in a way. And fourth cinema.
Oh, just mind, what's an example? What would be an example of third cinema that people might check out?
Like a movie?
Yeah.
I would say, let's see, what's a good film? You have like Glober Roca from Cinema Novo, who's a Brazilian filmmaker. You could watch like Black Dog, White Devil is a great film. Entranced Earth is a great film of his. I mean, there's so much out there.
Well, that's why I wish we could all take your class. That's why I'm trying to get these resources out to our the World is Wrong listeners. So feel free to pile on. We'll get these films seen more.
Yeah, I mean, there's like Jibril Diop Mambeti, Usman Simbine. They were Senegalese filmmakers. They're both passed. Jibril made Touki Bouki, which is one of my favorite films of all time. First movie, self-taught, and then his second film, Hyenas, is great, but he passed away of, I believe, a leukemia at the age of 50. And his niece is Maddie Diop. She made a movie called Atlantique. She's half French, half Senegalese. His brothers are like a famous musician, her daddy. So yeah, like third cinema. And then fourth cinema basically said that fourth cinema focuses explicitly on Native American cinema. They felt that third cinema still had, I guess, tropes of Western thought, and so fourth cinema was made to focus on like indigenous cinema, right?
Indigenous everywhere, or North American? Is there a difference applied in this definition?
Fourth cinema is indigenous anywhere. So like Native Americans, but like the Aborigines, like if there's filmmakers trying to make like fourth cinema theory focuses on that, right? Encompasses all means of indigenous cinema.
Got it.
Made for indigenous people by indigenous people, and I think. I'm trying to remember. I think there's I think it was coined like 20 years ago or so. I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years ago. But yeah, so the idea is like, indigenous cinema, even through first, second, and third cinema, doesn't really have complete opportunities to thrive. So fourth cinema, and these are theories, right? In the theory, you have to kind of try it out, see if it works. But fourth cinema was created to like give room for indigenous cinema. And, so if we want to take it even further, like black cinema, I wouldn't call it fifth cinema because I'm not trying to follow a numerical system. But for the sake of the conversation, one could say, well, fifth world cinema is black cinema from the diaspora, because then it takes, black cinema from the continent of Africa out of third world and then connects it to black Americans, black Canadians, black Australia, like any black diaspora peoples. So I'm trying to work on antagonistic cinema theory that focuses on the black diaspora without giving it a number, but then it can be utilized by other people as well, But again, it's the beginnings of this research. So that's my aim. My aim is for that. I mean, obviously, like I need money to make movies, but I don't need millions and millions of dollars, right? Like we waste so much money, obviously, in this country on so many things. But if a movie's budgeted $200 million and you break that down just from the salaries alone, what is really being left on screen is not $200 million. Like if people just took, like, do you need to make $20 million for film and you're making 3 films a year? Like who needs that much money? You know what I'm saying? So there can be a recalibration on how much films cost because they're just highly inflated, man. I mean, I don't know. Like it's the greed. The greed is a problem too. But
well, and it is, and also it's a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Are many $200 million movies going to speak to us in 30 years the way a film like Chameleon Street that you turned me on to does?
Yeah.
Are people going to rediscover a $200 million movie and be like, oh my God, how did we never notice that? I mean, like,
yeah.
It's sort of, again, it goes back to that punk rock thing. And I'm not even a huge punk rock fan. I just grew up in a punk rock town, so I inherited the ethos. My idea of being punk rock in a punk rock town is to play really sweet sounding music that's funny. But anyway, my point is that you can't make a great punk rock record in a record inside of a record company that is going to throw money at that record that's just going to make it sound like not a punk rock record. And in the same way, it's hard to make a powerful working class or statement film that really challenges the status quo.
Yeah.
If you have that huge budget, I think we're seeing that with a film like Don't Look Up.
Mm-hmm.
It wants so badly to be revolutionary.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's like revolutionaries at a very fancy party, and you can just feel it. Like if that film had been a low budget film, it might have more impact across the board. I'm not trying to pile onto that film. I'm just using that as one example.
Yeah, I mean, like, look at the class of people who made that, though. These are all, like, wealthy one-percenters who've been wealthy for a long time. And their hearts may be in the right place, right, for certain things, but maybe they're not the best messengers for that message, And it's almost like, I don't know. I mean, not to get too deep into the whole climate change issue, but it's we're basically overlooking a lot of really, to me, other equally important issues that we could be looking at that can be changed right away as we work towards, a better climate for the world. But saving the world from the effects of climate change, but allowing it to kind of stay fucked up as it is. I mean, that doesn't bode well for most of us,
Yeah.
So.
I wanted to ask a question about something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about European countries and how they fund films, art in general, to promote culture. Now, my limited understanding of that is that promoting culture means promoting their culture. Like, I had a lot of friends in Canada who got grants to promote Canadian content around the world.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't, and they might, I'm sure that at some point in that, they also did include Indigenous Canadian people. But do you feel, do minorities in those cultures have access to those grants if they are challenging those cultures, or are they up against a similar kind of prejudice in those countries that Hollywood enforces here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm sure they do. I mean, the bodies that award these films definitely have an agenda. Yeah, I was in Europe in September, and all of November I was in Paris, Italy, Germany. I went to Poland, and I was in the Netherlands, and I was talking to a lot of filmmakers, European filmmakers, and programmers, and all that, festival directors. And yes, these programs exist, but everyone has an agenda. So you even have to fight nepotism. You have to fight connections to get access to some of these funds. What tends to happen is you see the same people kind of getting the funds over and over.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean people break through and things don't fall through the cracks. But yes, you always, whenever there's an institution with a body of people who get the power to make a decision on something, they're going to have these biases, right? And so the goal would be to make it more of a like communal decision type thing, but it's hard. I mean, so yes, I'm sure there are people of color in these other countries who still struggle to get access to these funds. But I will say, people fall through the cracks. Look at Steve McQueen, his first movie with Michael Fassbender, Hunger, about the Irish IRA terrorist group, Bobby something, that actually got elected to Parliament, but as he died on his hunger strike. I mean, that movie was funded by Channel 4.
Bobby Sands. Sorry, just
Bobby Sands. Yeah, that movie was funded by Channel 4 in the UK and the Northern Ireland Film Fund, if I'm not mistaken. I believe the budget was $4 million. And so it took him years to get that movie funded, but finally he got funding in a way where, like, it's not like he had to pay that back, And it kind of gave him, he was making fine art films most of his career, and it wasn't until his 40s or so, late 30s, that he made Hunger. And that kind of gave him a chance to be seen by a wider audience. I mean, I'm sure if through some miracle, if the Sleeping Negro was able to get in front of 100,000 eyeballs, then I would have an easier chance of probably getting support financially to make something else a little bit bigger magnitude. But even when you make a movie successfully, it's like if you don't have enough money for the marketing, so then you have to deal with all the capitalistic issues that come along with the marketing industry, right? Then you have to deal with PR and all that stuff. So, like, at every level, you have to deal with this thing that the market dictates, and it makes it really challenging just to stay successful. I think filmmaking for me is a hobby. It has to be a hobby. It's not sustainable for me to have integrity, keep my sanity, and make movies in this current day and age, because you would have to sell your soul to Satan.
And I just want to point out that it's not like you're someone who hasn't tried. I know for a fact you have attempted to work within the system in Hollywood.
Yeah.
For a long time. You've taken the meetings, you've been with the big agencies, you've had, it's not just sort of like someone who's in some small town saying, "Oh, Hollywood does," Hollywood works this way. You've been in this machine. You've tried to figure out ways to work, and it seems like you've managed to figure out a way that a lot of, I would say, pure artists. Not to say in the sense, not to make that a qualitative judgment, but just like a descriptive. Like, as you say, it has to be a hobby, and you've found a place in academia where you can continue to focus on film, to teach film, to be supported in a way that you know, I in a way that I've watched from outside and been like, wow, that's the way to do it. That is the way to do it, you know. And again, you couldn't have done that if you hadn't done all the work that you've done in the world of academia to get there. So
Yeah.
I just want people who are listening, because a lot of times people will get on, I'll listen to a lot of podcasts and people make a lot of complaints, and it just sounds like they're someone who hasn't tried.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I would say for a good 15 years, I tried to play the game, you know. I went to USC Film School. I sold a TV show to Warner Brothers that fell apart. I mean, I've written so many scripts, it's not even funny. I've written pilots, I've written tons of features. I've been hired to write movies. I did that for a bit. And with each project, I would lose a piece of myself, my soul and stuff, and just got fed up with it. And I was very fortunate to fall into teaching. It was never the plan to be a professor. And in fact, I was only hired part-time by Loyola Marymount University for a couple of years. And then one of my friends, who was my boss at the time, got me a 1-year contract for like full-time teaching, but the pay was quite bad. But I needed it, you know. And I would have never gotten tenure track anything at LMU. It was not in the cards for me there. But when I made the Sleeping Negro and we went to Slam Dance and we sold the film after Slam Dance, I got a little bit more interest from other colleges for tenure track positions. And I realized, like, in my 40s, a lot of my favorite filmmakers were professors for a long time and still had a robust indie film life, you know. And I'm very thankful for the job that I have. I really enjoy teaching, and I enjoy working with young people and trying to help them figure out who they are as artists and what they want to say. But I have a lot of issues with Hollywood and how it's colonized cinemas of other people, and how it's if you don't go along with their program, you know, they'll try to crush you at every step. But what my point is, there is room for other types of cinema. People want to see it. They're just not given the choice. So, you know, it's challenging on your own to find those people around the world. You know, it's expensive. You have to fly and stay in hotels and eat. But you know, I don't know. I was asked this question on the German podcast last week. Has anything changed for Black cinema since, you know, Blaxploitation era, since LA Rebellion? And I was like, no, nothing has changed at all. Either you sell out or you don't. I mean, either you audition for a Marvel franchise by making some aesthetically pleasing indie film that has all the fixings of Hollywood underneath its veneer, and then you land some big studio movie and you start making millions of dollars making these vapid, banal, like very empty films, and you're rich and you can, when you're like, all these rich people just give each other awards and they say, oh, you're so amazing, you're so great, and it does nothing to advance the culture. It does nothing to put food on people's tables, a roof over their head. It doesn't challenge anything. To me, it's a waste of one's talent. So it's almost like America loves to spend so much money on its military, but yet it doesn't want to provide any type of basic social services for the citizens, you know.
Yeah.
That would cost way less than the military budget. It's just, Hollywood has money and they have the room to have an entire, I mean, it doesn't have to be through a Hollywood system. They could, you know, channel the money through a certain entity that then allows people to make what kind of art house films they want to make.
Which would be good for film in general and would
Yeah.
actually, in the end, be good for the industry if the industry is about making more and better films.
Yeah, but you're right. But Hollywood, I mean, Hollywood
Right.
propaganda arm of America. So
Right.
strong agenda, and that's the market's going to dictate what they do. But it's even these film festivals too that's a problem, man, because film festivals like Sundance and whatever, they have an opportunity to really discover new talent, really say, look, this is cool. But all they're doing is becoming an extension of Hollywood. And they're just programming studio indie films, quote unquote indie, but they're studio films, A24, Neon, that already have distribution to sell lots of tickets. It's so crazy, man. It's like,
Yeah, again, coming from music, that's like all the music festivals that I ever went to in the 90s and whatnot. This is where we launch indie bands, but then all the showcases are all the major showcases are with major bands on major labels.
Yeah.
So let's just talk. I want to get into some sort of examples, because one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been thinking about this conversation this week, we saw the passing of Sidney Poitier.
yeah,
And for a lot of people, Sidney Poitier is the beginning of like a black cinema, the same way that Jackie Robinson is the beginning of black baseball, which means that it's not the beginning, it's the beginning of the integration, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I've been wondering, because I know that I know we've talked about this before. I know your feelings about the history of Hollywood cinema. And yet I'm curious, are there people, maybe Poitier's one, maybe other people are, who have, whether or not they've successfully achieved what you'd like to achieve outside of the Hollywood system, that inspired you, or that you feel like we're reaching for that, or standing on the shoulders of giants kind of thing?
Yeah, Paul Robeson.
Mm-hmm.
If he came before Sidney, and
Right.
He got blackballed. He got ruined in America because he was a communist, rightfully so. I mean, he was black people were not even really deemed human, when he was coming up, and he had to do certain things in the beginning of his career, for money, but he always advocated for the black struggle. Sidney advocated for the black struggle as well. I mean, a lot of the black performers coming up back in the day were completely neutered in a way. It was either you do this to make money or you don't. But most of them, when they got a platform and they got ears and eyeballs on them, they did the right thing to the best of their ability, given the time they were living in. I mean, Paul Robeson and Sidney were living in a time where lynching was legal.
Mm-hmm.
And same with a lot of musicians, But Paul Robeson's integrity and how he stood up to the American government and fought for black liberation and struggled to make ends meet towards the end of his life was very inspiring to me. Be willing to sacrifice a career to fight for what's right. And it's very easy to get caught up in the money. I mean, capitalism will reward you handsomely if you go along with the system, But that doesn't bode well for the future of black people. It doesn't bode well for the future of humans in period, and we just have the stronger imagination. But I mean, I'm thankful I couldn't imagine what I would do or how I would live coming up in this country at a time that, Sidney Poitier and Paul Robeson and Dorothy Dandridge and so many others came up in. I think a lot of times we have presentism that we want to put on to a situation. Like we see choices that were made through how things would be done today, But what I'm afraid of is the progress that those giants made basically getting squandered and disappearing because of how people are so willing to sell out for money. these days.
Well, I got to reflect back, but not you. And you're
Yeah.
you're special, or you're unique but not special. You're special but not unique. There's Paul Robeson continues to inspire people.
Yeah.
Inspire me. Like, I don't think you have to be black to be inspired by Paul Robeson.
Yeah.
His, like, in the family I grew up in, he's seen as a hero.
Yeah.
And not a solo hero. There were people across the board who made similar choices and lost similarly, and that's why people who listen to the show know that the Red Scares and the anti-communist witch hunts and the just misrepresentation of the Communist Party as this sort of evil force, when they were the only political party in the United States that was opposed to lynching and working actively against it at the time, that's a really big one for me. But I think I totally hear what you're saying, but I don't want to underestimate the value of a career like Paul Robeson's, or of, again, the artists who had to make great sacrifices but inspire us today.
For sure.
It shouldn't be seen as a small thing. Like,
Robeson
lost in life in a way, but he didn't, because, as you say, he maintained his integrity and his soul. But he speaks to us more today than most film artists of his time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a lot of artists out there like me that want to make this art. It's just we're all struggling to get support, financing, distribution support, marketing support. I mean, the Sleeping Negro didn't get programmed in a lot of theaters based on the title alone. I spoke about that in the article in Filmmaker Magazine. I mean, Film Forum and others are like, without even looking at the movie. I mean, we're slowly getting into more cities. We're going to be in Columbus, Pittsburgh, and all other places. But there's a lot of people out there that feel the same way. And I know a lot of them. But we're just trying to, find that circle of support. And it's very hard because you're swimming up against a current,
So it's sort of implied in this conversation, but and we haven't mentioned them, but there are some sort of prominent black filmmakers in America that are generally trotted out as like, okay, well, this is black cinema. Spike Lee, Ava DuVernay, filmmakers who I enjoy. I enjoy Hollywood movies. That's what I come from. So I'm definitely entertainable, but I'm not. But I think your perspective on those and maybe other filmmakers you'd like to mention, not to invite you to tear anyone down, but to maybe just speak to the dynamic that these popular Black American filmmakers represent.
Well, I think like all these black filmmakers, Barry Jenkins, Nate Parker, these guys, Spike. I mean, Spike, when he started off, he was doing amazing film work, talking about the community, challenging things. And then you become very wealthy and successful. And then you kind of like the cars and you like the houses and you like the ease of what this capitalistic life gives you when you have money. And then you start to, get confused on political things and choices. So it's hard. I mean, like when you become wealthy in this system, it's very easy to be like, all right, well, let's just take the easy path forward. I think it takes time to see who people become over their body of work, And I think people like Barry Jenkins and those cats, I'm not super excited about what they got coming down the pike. You know what I'm saying? Like, why are we remaking things like Lion King when there's so many rich black stories that could be told via someone that now has access and kind of can do whatever they want within a way, But whenever people get to that level of doing whatever they want, they tend to like just forget who they were and they just do whatever is commercial success, But it's like, I don't know. I mean, I go back and forth with it because I'm not in their shoes. I just know that there's so many stories that are worth being told, not through a Hollywood system, but some of these cats probably could pull financing easily to tell them and then still reach an audience. You know what I'm saying? So I do feel like those cats make Black Hollywood. I will give Ava credit that she has Array, and she's been picking up Black art house filmmakers, you know. So people who wouldn't have a platform are getting a platform through her. But I have to separate what she's doing for the community in that regard from her politics and the movies that she makes personally. And, you know, I don't know, like, when you've been rich longer than you've been poor, your class consciousness changes, and that stuff just constantly has to be kept in check. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, I think anything, even art house films, have to have some type of entertaining value to it, or why would anyone watch it, you know? But a lot of times when you say entertaining value, you think explosions and sex and all the violence and all this stuff.
Actually, this is this is a question I wanted to ask as well, because when I think of entertaining, I just think of, like, if I laugh a couple times in the movie, like, and we talk a lot about comedies on this podcast, and I don't know, I see Chameleon Street as, it's a dark comedy, but I think it's a comedy, right?
Yeah, it's a satire, yeah, right. For sure.
In terms of, like, where do you think Black cinema or Black comedies fit in your view of antagonistic cinema?
Well, I mean, they definitely have a place. It just depends on how it's approached. I'm not a comedy person at all. I'm not a comedian, stand-up comic. I don't make funny movies. I think a lot of comedians, to become a famous stand-up comic, it's all about the individual, right? You're you. And so you take that into movies, and it kind of just continues that super American Western hyper individualism. And so I think in order for comedy to have a place in what I would consider antagonistic cinema, then it would have to be like a Chameleon Street, taking really heavy subjects and telling them through a comedic way that's relatable, but also that's blunt and potent, right? And I've never seen a movie like Chameleon Street since Chameleon Street, and that came out in 1990, you know, and but I just don't see a lot of current Black comics going that route, because a lot of them are coming from stand-up, which is all about the individual, and they're just trying to get famous and successful. You know, they're not trying to change the status quo. They need to maintain it.
It was a long time ago, and I don't have a very clear memory of the film, and my consciousness was very different when it came out. But what about a film like Hollywood Shuffle? Robert Townsend's Hollywood Shuffle.
Hollywood Shuffle is great. But again, like, we're talking one film every so often. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, there could definitely be more. What I'm just trying to do is to hunt out some examples.
Yeah. Hollywood Shuffle is a big example. I mean, it was a satirical comedy, and he critiqued the racial stereotypes in Hollywood. I mean, it's a great movie. It's a wonderful film. But again, like,
you didn't get to make many more. That's for sure.
And he now teaches at USC. I mean, it's like there should have been 1,000 of those types of Chameleon Street Hollywood Shuffles, because a lot of people had those ideas, but they could never get support for it. You know, and Hollywood Shuffle was not financed by a studio. It's one of those things, kind of like sweet badass song. I mean, that was like money pulled from the Black community because no one would support it. So once something blows up like this, then you're going to see imitations that take out the political aspect of it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But also too, you had to think, like, back then, like, you had Keenan Ivory Wayans with Living Color. Like, we don't have anything like that, even in our culture and the media. Like, we don't have a living color. Everything is so reactionary on both left and right sides. Everything is so, like, you have the dressings of a joke, but you have no substance of a joke. So, like, the timing is perfect and it sounds like a joke, but it really is not. No one is saying anything. And
so, are you a fan of the Wayans brothers' work?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. That's funny. We were talking about my co-host is a huge fan of their work, and we were talking about doing an episode about 50 Shades of Black.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched it and I was like, I don't know, this have you seen 50 Shades of Black?
I haven't seen 50 Shades of Black, no.
So it starts off, if you've seen 50 Shades of Grey, which he made me watch so I could watch 50 Shades of Black.
Mm-hmm.
It starts off with this rich guy running and getting into his car and doing all the stuff. And then they do a parody of it, sort of Airplanes, the Zucker Brothers style. And he's running, but then he steals this woman's purse. And then there's a fancy car and he steals the fancy car from the valet. And I was just like, why is it doing this stereotype? And then the film isn't even that he's still just a rich guy. It just it makes this joke about a black guy being a criminal at the beginning of this movie. And I was like, but then this is the disconnect of like, what is the language of black cinema? And maybe why I'm asking this about like, maybe comedy is because so much about comedy is like a shared experience and you have to have the shared experience to find it funny.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. I was really expecting that that the Wayans brothers would be not something that you liked, but again, that's just probably my own prejudice coming out.
Well, no, I would say early Wayans brothers. I think Keenan especially. I mean, Marlon is funny, but Keenan really was the brains behind a lot of that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
And Keenan doesn't really do a whole lot right now. So 50 Shades of Black, I don't know if I would dig that particular movie because I haven't watched the Wayans brothers film since way back in the day. But I'm talking basically Living Color days.
Yeah.
We don't have anything like that cultural critique through comedy anymore, even in the black community. You know what I'm saying? Everything is like assimilated into. It's almost like America and the West do a great job of erasing the distinct characteristics of our identities. My friend Mtume made a great movie called Whiteface, a short film about that. It's like, you're an American actor, you're not a black actor. No, I'm a black filmmaker. Because that's very important to make that distinction. Until we live in a more equitable society, my skin color dictates how I'm treated. And it dictates opportunities, for me. And so that's just the truth of the reality of the situation. You can ignore it and say post-racial and say, I don't see color, but you just sound like an idiot.
Yeah.
You just sound like a straight idiot. So, I think there's room for all genres, even horror genre, sci-fi, but it's like, who's really focusing on trying to take those genres to a whole nother level to critique and to say something important versus just trying to get rich and get picture deals and make money and live in a big house. Like you want a big house, is move to freaking Iowa and buy a house for $50,000. Big house, with a whole bunch of land. If you really it's like, I don't know, man. I mean, it's like we live in a very narcissistic society because of social media. So people always want to just up the next person. Like, I'm doing this, I'm driving this car. And we're losing ourselves in a major way. And, I'm a cynic, pessimist, because how can you not be? I mean, it's the world around us is insane.
I believe I think you might even be saying that the world is wrong.
Yeah, the world is
yeah. Yeah. So my co-host wanted me to ask you about another filmmaker that he's a big fan of. He's a big Tyler Perry booster. He's got me to watch some of his movies. I'm just impressed with sort of like the audacious shifts in tone in them, and also anyone who's doing something, who's managing to carve out an indie space within the film industry is someone who I'm inclined to celebrate, whether or not I like their films. What are your thoughts on what Tyler Perry's been able to put together?
I mean, I would say this. I have to give props to Tyler Perry for basically just creating his own table that he can sit at. He's definitely connected to the black audience in a way where a lot of other black filmmakers have never connected. But again, that goes back to triangular cinema theory in terms of the re-education of the critic and the audience. So that's one. I'm not a big fan of his movies in general. I just think that they're all kind of one and the same, you know. And but I'm not gonna like. I think he's done a lot for the Black community. I think it's quite amazing that he was able to, even through capitalism, like create this empire. Only time will tell how that really truly benefits the Black community. But am I seeking out his films? Nah, I'm not. You know, like I've watched 6 or 7 Medea films. I think they're funny. But
have you watched Medea Goes to Prison?
I think I have. I've watched the Janet Jackson one. I watched quite a few, and they're entertaining. But I mean, like in terms of walking away, feeling like, okay, you know, I've been satiated now. I don't get that from Tyler Perry, but I don't hate him like a lot of people hate him. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. It's he's I try to find I mean, he's done a lot more for the community just on a financial, monetary level than a lot of other rich cats. But at the same time, it's like capitalism forces us to deal with it on an individual level. These problems, you know, like capitalism creates poverty and then criminalizes poverty. So, but I'm not like he can make the 5 movies and I probably would not seek them out. Now, if I'm with my wife or some friends and we're kind of high or wasted and it's late and on cable, am I going to change the channel? Probably not. I'll probably watch it, you know, but I'm not like sitting by the window waiting for the next Tyler Perry joint to drop. I don't really do that with anyone, really, to be honest with you.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you is like, so who are you, like, who inspires you today? Who are you following?
They're all dead. They're all dead. And so their body of work is, I mean, not all of them. I mean, Saimi Liang is a huge inspiration. He's Malaysian, but he's I believe he's raised in Taiwan. He's a Taiwanese filmmaker. He's made like 9 or 10 features. I've seen them all except for one. I would say Bellatar is a big inspiration. He's still alive, but he quit making narratives in 2011. Merawi Gerima is still alive, but he can't get funding to make another movie. Charles Burnett's still alive, but he's still trying to get projects off the ground. He's 75 years old. So there's not a lot, you know, like if Merawi Gerima dropped the joint, I'll be there first night, opening night. You know what I'm saying? Same with Saimi Liang, but these cats are in the 60s and 70s. No one young. And a lot of my favorite filmmakers are long gone. So, or they're still alive and they haven't made a movie in 20, 30 years because no one thinks, you know, will support them. So that's just kind of how it is, you know.
Now, I think you may have said this at the beginning of our talk, or maybe it's something that I read in preparing for this, reading some of the interviews you've done, but you do consider yourself to be a part of a group of filmmakers who are all on a similar page. Would you like to speak to who they are?
Yeah. So Merawi Gerima, he's the son of Haile Shirikiana. His mom's name is Shirikiana, and they both were LA Rebellion students, filmmakers from UCLA. So Merawi Gerima, Mtume Gant, he's a film professor and filmmaker, a musician in New York. Jonathan Burnett, he's the son of Charles Burnett. He was one of my students at LMU. He now teaches at Pratt. I think Jonathan teaches at Pratt. So the 4 of us are working on an anthology, and the goal is to just keep making projects and kind of champion each other in our pursuits because we're trying to introduce a new wave of Black cinema. And Mtume and I are the same age. I think Jonathan and Merawi are the same age, and there's like a 10-year gap between Jonathan Merawi, myself, and Mtume. They're in their early 30s. We're in our early 40s. Their dads are legendary, and also filmmakers. And our dads, I think, and Mtume's dad is a musician. My dad was a musician too, or is a musician. So we're trying to start something new, And there's other people too who would bring into the fold, but we're, it's hard. It's hard. Just getting support. So for us, it's a hobby, and most of us are teachers. I mean, Merawi Gerima was a teacher for 40 years at Harvard. Charles Burnett teaches at where does he teach? Bard. Been teaching at Bard. So it is a way to kind of sustain yourself and to find support. I mean, I'm about to make another feature in April with some grant money from my institution that I work with. It ain't a lot, but it's enough to kind of get going. So, it's like you got to scrape where you can. And most people, even how they write movies, it's like they need millions of dollars. I'm like, yo, I can make a feature for 20 grand. If that's how I got to do it for the rest of my life, okay, then we're going to make these small films. But they'll be made,
as you're talking about it, really, Hollywood's loss is academia's gain. And in a weird way, not that I'd like to see these people, yourself included, getting the funding to make the films that I should be able to enjoy or be challenged by.
Yeah.
But the idea that there are these great filmmakers, that students have access to these teachers, and that these teachers are teaching the filmmakers of the future.
Yeah.
That is, in a weird way, it's kind of hopeful. Like if Merawi Gerima was getting to make lots of movies, which he should be able to, then he probably wouldn't be able to be the professor that he is. And you've got to think of generations of students coming through that class and coming out into the world. Who's to say that that's not a more powerful way to live?
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah, totally. I would agree with that. So.
And it's it's a weird kind of blessing that comes from the messed up system. Like if they were more successful, they wouldn't be able to do the good work they're doing. And not that we should encourage. I hope that I'd like to see all these filmmakers. I'd like to see you get so successful that you could fund the next film from Charles Burnett and Wendell B. Harris and Merawi Gerima.
Yeah.
Which I guess is again, you're not pursuing a path that's going to make you a Spike Lee, Ava DuVernay, Barry Jenkins kind of money so that you could do that. But is that ultimately on some level the goal?
Yeah. I mean, at one, I would fund anything that they wanted to do. And then I would also take whatever big money I had and try to find ways to, uplift the Black community, the poor Black community. I mean, it wouldn't be about investing that money to make money. I mean, like, I would be helping people left and right. But that's me. That's not everybody, And I don't know any of these rich Black people personally, so I can't say if they're on the down low doing these things. I know Prince, when he died, it came out that he had spent a lot of his fortune on helping people. And the one caveat was, you don't tell anybody that I'm helping you. So that was cool. That's great. But Prince also, too, was an amazing artist who was not all about selling out and status quo. He fought the studio system, the music industry, quite intensely. So we knew where he kind of stood with integrity. But yeah, I mean, I would totally support these older cats, but they're not, it's like, I don't know. It's, also don't know if I want to keep making movies forever. I mean, I have some things I want to get off my chest, but it's not the best way. It's not the best usage of money,
Yeah. Well, one of the things we say on the podcast a lot is if you've made one movie, that's an accomplishment. You've made one good or great movie, that's a phenomenal accomplishment. If you've made two or three, that's a career. And, and there are some people who can keep it going, but there are diminishing returns. We had a filmmaker on named Paul Williams, who was one of the very early new Hollywood guy, a young guy in Hollywood in the early 60s or mid 60s, making films. And so he was colleagues with Scorsese. Like he met all these people when he was a little bit ahead of them. Like they were coming to meet with him, Spielberg, Scorsese, Coppola. And it's interesting to talk to him now because I think he made 5 films. Feels good about them, and he walked away, and he doesn't feel bad about walking away. And he looks at someone like a Spielberg, and he's like, the guy is an amazing filmmaker, but he's going to drop dead making films and never have learned anything about being a human being.
Yeah, I totally can see that. Yeah.
So I think that gets to what you're talking about, is like there's a certain amount of, if you're just pursuing to pursue, you need to take breaks. He said he learned this, or he was given this information, this wisdom from a meeting he was able to have with Jean Renoir, who said basically, you should always take breaks between your films, and if you don't have a life, you can't be a filmmaker. Where what you're saying is like Hollywood kind of demands that you don't have a life and you stay on that treadmill. If you're going to be the most successful filmmakers, that's what they do. Yep. They never stop working, which is not necessarily the best measure of success.
Yeah, not at all.
I was going to say on that line, I hope that someday you get to stop making films, but not before you've made just a few more, because I'd like to see them. And I would love to see your films get successful for our sake as well as for yours, because I think what you're talking about, and I'm very interested in this anthology film you're talking about. I'm just excited. I think on this podcast we're pro-film, and we're excited about movies that go places that other films don't go, even if that means alienating some of the audience, maybe a majority of the audience. And the filmmakers who are willing to do that are the ones that we're the most excited about. And I think that you bring in this other aspect of it. Like I said, I think I'd say 90% of what you're saying could be applied to anyone who has a unique artistic vision in a capitalist society and wants to find a way to express that to a large number of people. And I, in a way, I'd like to universalize the message in that way as we close this, for people to take inspiration from the way that you've managed to maintain your independent voice and your independent spirit, even at there are costs that go with it. But from the outside, when I'm watching, I know you're a cynic and you're a pessimist, and I'm with you on that. And at the same time, the fact that you are able to continue to do the work you're doing and gather the community that you're gathering, and to share this information with me, and so I can share it with others, I think that's all reason for guarded optimism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
I agree.
So where can people track you down? Where can people find your work? Are you on any of the social media posting about stuff? Where would you like people to track you down?
They can go to skinnermyers.com and hit me up there. And then the sleepingnegro.com is where the film web page is. Art Matin Films is our distributor for the USA, and Sudo Connection is our distributor internationally. We're on Instagram as the Sleeping Negro Film, and we're on Twitter as TSN_film. So they can find the film stuff there and go to my personal website to get in touch with me, skinnermyers.com.
Excellent. And I encourage everyone to follow those, and just keep an eye out for the Sleeping Negro when it comes to an art house near you in the coming year, and then eventually to streaming in all the places where films stream.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Skinner. Always a pleasure talking with you. I hope you're putting together your Noscars list. Last year's Noscars list was you just knocked it out of the park. And in fact, the film we're going to be covering on our next episode is Residue. I'm going to do a full episode about that, and so maybe we'll get it right and you'll enjoy it.
That sounds good.
Radio 8 Ball.
Andras here. When I'm not co-hosting The World is Wrong podcast, I'm hosting and producing the Radio 8 Ball podcast, where we answer questions by picking songs at random, like picking musical tarot cards. We've hosted musical divinations for people like John C. Reilly, Patricia Arquette, Tig Notaro, and Fred Armisen, and hosted over 200 songwriters, providing the randomly chosen answers from Inara George and Dan Byrne to Mose Allison and Alan Toussaint. That's Radio 8 Ball, all one word. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and download our app from the iTunes App Store.
Hey y'all, it's Amy from the Pink Among Men podcast. I know, you are really, really busy with your sourdough starter and your fourth rewatch of The Office. So it's totally cool if you don't have time for an informative, perspective-bending podcast right now. But if you do have a few minutes to spare in your jam-packed schedule, I want to offer Pink Among Men for your consideration. Pink Among Men is a weekly conversation on different perspectives, gender, and marginalization in the creative community. We chat with actors from shows you watch, directors who make movies that you want to watch, and comedians from stand-up shows that you'll probably never watch, but you should. Every Wednesday, they sit down to talk about the tragedy and the triumph that comes with not being a white dude in arts and entertainment. You probably don't have time for it, but maybe subscribe so you can listen when you're a little less busy. Get Pink Among Men on Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're a proud member of the Paper House Network.
Dear listener, if you are just discovering our podcast, you can find all of our episodes on our website at theworldiswrongpodcast.com. You can also write to us at contact@theworldiswrongpodcast.com or follow us on Instagram at The World Is Wrong Podcast. And now, back to the show.
That was cool. I want to take a class taught by him. That sounds great. It makes me miss film school. There's like people that are that smart about movies and can just kind of drop all these little seeds, in your mind of not just movies to see, but just different ways to think about movies. That makes for a very good film professor. So I have a feeling that he is going to have some pretty great filmmakers coming out of his tutelage.
Well, of course you think so, because he backed you up on the Wayans brothers.
Yeah, I mean, among many other things.
But didn't that make you happy?
Well, he kind of backed me up on the Wayans brothers. I feel like he is clearly into the early stuff, like the Keenan Ivory Wayans, but he hasn't seen sort of the more, what I'd say is challenging films, like the Marlon Wayans. Like, he didn't have an opinion on a White Chicks or a Little Man. So once he goes through all of them and praises them, then I'll know he's on my side. But I'll give him half a point.
I think it's the other way around. I think you might have got half a point. He's the professor.
I got half a point. No, that was I'm glad you threw that in there. It was good to hear. Well, he brought it up. He brought it up through talking about Hollywood Shuffle. So that was fantastic that he brought it up, and then you had to talk more about the Wayans. So that was cool.
Yes, and we will be doing a Wayans Brothers episode. We've already started talking about it. We're going to do
someday.
Yeah, so like along the lines of what we've done with Stephen Frears and Nicole Kidman. Maybe not a full month on the Wayans Brothers, but definitely one epic episode where you talk about all of the movies and TV shows and whatnot, and I will try and keep up.
Yeah, I like it.
But yeah, I'm glad you dug it. I felt like there was a lot there for, like, as you said, just planted a lot of seeds and places for people to explore. And yeah.
And I think it's cool. I think it's cool too because it's just a different way of thinking about black cinema. Because I feel like most people, they do just kind of think like, oh, Spike Lee. I've seen Spike Lee movies. Yeah. Done. And it's nice to know that there's a much bigger world, like, that's been going on for a long time. It just that isn't what people are talking about, or it's not what's taught in most film schools. It's just like these movies he's talking about from like Nigeria and stuff. Like, I've never heard of these people. and now I know, which is great. And I didn't know about just the whole, like the first way, like he was talking about the 4 cinemas. Like I didn't know, I never heard that before either. Seemed like you didn't either. You were talking about it, asking questions. Like have you? I never heard of it talked about in that way, which was fascinating.
Nor had I, and until I met Skinner, I'd never heard anyone talk about the LA Rebellion film movement, which now seems, it's one of those things like when this was happening at a time when I was alive and for a good chunk of it in LA, paying attention, being very much on the ground in the film business, and to realize how segregated a world which you thought was desegregated is it's just an odd and disorienting feeling. But it's good to have it because it means you've expanded. But then just realizing how
you mean the film world?
Yeah,
is that what you mean?
Yeah, the film.
Well, yeah,
world.
I mean, it's like it's sad because you think of Hollywood as being this very open, liberal place, or at least for a while now, and it's sad to know that the history of that's even taught in schools is as wrong and leaving so much out as like U.S. history is or other histories. It's very much guided towards the wealthy white Hollywood people, like film school. The classes, at least the classes I took, it's still like even at Evergreen. Like I went to Evergreen and there was definitely like queer cinema and it dipped its toes into things, but we were still kind of studying and watching Citizen Kane, Jean-Luc Godard, like the basic film school stuff, all good. But like there's so much more.
Actually, it's crazy. The only time that I was introduced to this movement, while not necessarily being aware that I was being introduced to a movement, was seeing Killer of Sheep in a class at Evergreen.
Yeah. That's a great movie.
Yeah.
And that's probably the most well-known of that. But like, I didn't know it was even part of a movement. I just assumed it was just a good movie from a long time ago. But now because I love that movie, so I'm excited now to kind of dig in and find out more about all the other people from that time. No, that's fantastic. And I think he also hit on in this episode just certain thoughts that I have about movies and the kind of like independent film and the state of independent film in Hollywood. And I feel like if I sat down with Skinner, I feel him and I would really get along. I think we have the same kind of ideas of the bullshit factory and sort of the what independent film should be and could be but isn't. Like that's definitely been something that I've been thinking about for a while, especially since making my first movie a few years ago. So like I think just sort of he's hit on some interesting things just about sort of like the kind of cinema that could and should exist, but sadly is few and far between.
Yeah, and just that idea that there are like the people that we think of as being the independent successes in the film business are really are a lot of them. They're like this, how he describes the Spike Lees. Like, yeah, your first couple of films you're independent, but if you're independent in that system, the system starts to work on you. And
and it happens so many times. So many filmmakers that will make like one movie that like comes out of Sundance or even like festivals not as big that has a unique voice, and then they just get sucked into something that Disney is making. It's their second movie, and you're like, what happened? Is it? I mean, I've never been in that position, so maybe it's hard to turn the money away when you've struggled for so long, and you're like, well. And then I think a lot of filmmakers tell themselves, well, I'll take this money, but then the next one will be back to the little thing, but then you just never go back. There's a filmmaker whose name I will not say, because it's, I just like, this was a story I heard about them where they were making their small movies. Their movies got bigger, and then they couldn't ever go back to making the small movies because they just got too comfortable and too happy that all these other people were doing all the work. And it's like, oh, when I direct now, it's more relaxed and I don't have to like run around as much. And so it's like treating your job like you're working at a Home Depot and now you're the manager in the office and you don't have to do the heavy lifting. I don't know if that's how art should be made. I don't know. That's just my opinion.
Well,
but
and I think that, I mean, it's sort of what Skinner is talking about is, I mean, he's coming at it from his own particular point of view, but I think there are some people who make art with the intention to please others, and you might make a really great artistic little first film, but you did that to please one group of people, and then you get hired to work in Hollywood, and now you're pleasing another group of people, and people-pleasing people generally are more successful, and so that just builds itself up, whereas certain other artists, which I definitely consider myself to be a part of, and I don't necessarily even say that's better or worse, but there is an antagonistic aspect, and like you're not even antagonizing someone else, you're antagonizing yourself and your own, the things that you're thinking about that matter to you. And I think for those people, I think either they don't succeed in the film business, or they succeed to such a level that they're allowed to continue to please themselves, regardless of whether or not. Like I guess I'm thinking of like someone like Hal Hartley as someone to me who seems like he's so. What he's doing is so antagonistic to everything else that everyone else is doing. And he got lucky enough that pleased some people and got popular at a time. Yeah. But I don't get the sense that when he was given budgets, he also made films that were just like the films. Like he could only make one kind of film. It seemed like a Hal Hartley film. He didn't. And those are the artists. And those people wouldn't even know how to please someone if they were given the opportunity to. And I really do think those are two different artistic personalities. And maybe Spike Lee is more of a people pleaser, even though he seems, I mean, he's definitely an antagonizer. But I think maybe that's where what's going unsaid in our conversation is what's different is that what I think what Skinner's saying is that Spike Lee is kind of making movies more for you and me than for Skinner and what he's trying to represent anymore. But, I think, there's just so many different complexities. The other thing I was thinking about this while we were talking just now is something you said in the episode we did last week about Even Cowgirls Get the Blues, where we were talking about who could direct it. And you were saying, well, in 1993, there weren't really any women directors who were successful who could have made this film. And I threw in Jane Campion because she was the only one that we could think of. But I feel like I think probably someone who was sort of the way Skinner is hooked into the LA Rebellion, that a female filmmaker or someone who was hip to the female director scene in the early 90s was probably screaming into their pod server that like a list of 10 names of women who totally could have done it and were making films that were playing the festival circuits that we just weren't hip to, just like we weren't
didn't
hip
hear
to them.
about. Yeah,
and we'd love if you are that person. We'd love to have you on as a guest to tell us how the world is wrong about women's cinema. If there is such a thing as women's cinema, maybe there is women's cinema. It seems like it would just be cinema that is made by women. Something about women's cinema sounds like it's like a women's league and a sports thing. Like they get paid less, they get less. Just cinema made by women. Okay, well, thanks for holding space for this conversation. Even though you weren't there, I felt you. Yeah, I hope your presence was felt in it. I would never have asked him about Tyler Perry or the Wayans brothers without you, Brian. So,
yeah, and he gave good answers to both, so I'm satisfied.
No, good. The professor gets an A from the video store clerk. That's awesome. You're more than you were a video store manager. I know. Okay, well, next week we are going to be talking about a film that Skinner introduced us to in last year's Oscars ceremony, a film called Residue from his friend, the director Merawi Gerima. And you can find that on Netflix, so check it out before we get to it. And if you'd like to share your thoughts on what we talked about in this episode, you can find us at theworldiswrongpodcast.com. You can write to us at contact@theworldiswrongpodcast.com. You can find us on Instagram at The World Is Wrong Podcast, and you can find us on Twitter at World Is Wrong Pod. And yeah, is there any particular question you'd like to hear what people have an answer to, Brian? Or you have anything you want to prompt the listeners to maybe reach out to us, because it feels so goddamn lonely making this podcast. So glad that you're here to keep me company.
I just want to hear more about other movies. Like, I want to hear from the people, like we did from Skinner in this episode. Like, let's hear the black cinema that you think that we don't know about, or any movie, really. Yeah. And we're open to do episodes about any movie that strikes our fancy when we watch it, And in fact, the next episode is one that Skinner told us about, and so like we don't just have a master list that we've stuck to for, and then we're not adding to it or changing it. Like we're jumping around and being surprised by new things that we didn't know about. We know a lot about movies, but we don't know everything about movies.
Yes, we are part of the world, Brian. And as we like to remind the listeners, that wherever they are, the world is wrong, and it's probably wrong about them and us and you.
Hi, I'm Brian.
And I'm AJ.
And we have a podcast called The Director's Wall,
examining a filmmaker's career, film by film. First up was M. Night Shyamalan, then Francis Ford Coppola. Who's next? Is there anything to this whole auteur theory? Find out on
The Director's Wall.
Subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your preferred listening platform.